Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by Agile Thought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to this episode of the Agile Coaches Corner podcast. I am your host, Dan Neumann, and I am thrilled that you are taking some time to listen to our podcast, and also excited for folks who are responding to podcast@agilethought.com and sharing your ideas with me. I have some thoughts on my mind right now about the use of artificial intelligence, especially as it applies for our Agile teams. I think there's a lot of excitement about AI. Obviously, it's big in the news. It's huge. It's changing how people view work and definitely raising some concerns. I'm here and wanting to talk to you about how specifically maybe you could consider using artificial intelligence for your Agile teams. Of course, if you listen through here and you go, gosh, here's something we're thinking about or concerned about, something we've tried but couldn't get to work, I would love to have that feedback as well. So, and when I'm thinking about artificial intelligence in this context, a lot of it is about generative AI. Of course, OpenAI is certainly near the top of the headlines. Some of the examples I'll use here are from my experience with Copilot for Microsoft 365, and specifically because a lot of times what data I want to use is data that I would not necessarily want accidentally leaked out into a model, or to have that model get trained based on my data, because, well, let's face it, the projects we're working on are kind of nobody else's business until we are ready to make them known to, in our case, our clients, or if we're working on projects for our clients, when they're ready to make it known to their users, to their world. So there's a lot of sensitivity around just using some of the free models that are available, putting data in there, which then there's some risk that it gets trained based on what you're providing it. And of course, that could be problematic. Let's start with some simple examples and we'll see where we go from there. I am working on a project, and our project team has a definition of done for the work that we are doing. Of course, we have lots of ideas for our definition of done, and we have a pretty robust one, I think. It's pretty good. I find that AI can be a very good thinking partner in addition to your team members. So getting some candidate enhancements for a definition of done to then socialize with the team, talk about the pros, the cons. I would not turn the definition of done over to the machine, the AI machine, and then follow what it says, but I would definitely use it as a thinking partner. Something that you can bring into your team, get some feedback on, and maybe you have some of those, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Or, gosh, why couldn't we do X, Y, or Z? So think about just a simple thing. Some of your team working agreements, you can feed them into an AI and go, hey, what do you think about that? And I would suspect your team working agreement may not be super secret or some kind of industry intellectual property that you need to protect. So could probably do that inside of one of those free models that I was talking about earlier. You could also use it to look at retrospective data over time for your team. Let's say you're capturing your retrospective information into Word documents, or even using an online tool like Miro. I love using Miro. Shout out to them. They make online collaboration super easy. You can put sticky notes, draw pictures, use emojis. AI would be able to not just look at the textual information and do simple things like finding out what's the most talked about topic, but it could look for trends over time in terms of sentiment or the way people are interacting. What shifts have there been in how your retrospective feedback has been coming in? So you could use it as a retrospective partner. In addition to looking at the data that you've been collecting about your retrospectives over time, you could also look at the way that you're setting up the facilitation for your retrospectives. And that maybe then becomes something that you would use your artificial intelligence for as well. So looking at your team's definition of done, maybe your working agreements, looking at your retrospective sentiment over time, trends, patterns, etc., using AI as a thinking partner in how to structure your retrospectives, maybe to get a particular outcome. Those are 3 of the things so far. I also have seen some valuable support from AI for activities like release forecasting. Now, again, I like that Microsoft calls their application a co-pilot. This is not to turn off your brain and turn it over to the machine. But imagine, if you will, you were to take your historic velocity, the average pace that you've been delivering working software at. Now you look at your backlog and you go, gosh, I wonder when we might get, the next 300 points of work done, the next 25 product backlog items, or the next 200 product backlog items. I ran an example where I took our team's velocity, then I looked at the product backlog item and used it as input into what was called a Monte Carlo simulation. And there's lots of ways to do that. You may have seen a Monte Carlo simulation when you think of stock market prediction for returns. Basically, what a Monte Carlo simulation does is it looks at historic data and then it runs a bunch of simulations, randomly selecting from your historic data to create a realm of future possibilities for you. You can think of this when you see things like hurricane forecasts, where you get these cones of uncertainty about where the project might go. That's what we're doing here with our information. I've done this before using spreadsheets. People, of course, can write code to do it. It can get very complex. I took the historic velocity as a simple table, sprint by sprint, velocity numbers. I asked for a Monte Carlo simulation forecasting, the next X hundred points. And what I got was the 50% probability, the 75%, the 90% probability for those future forecasts. And now I have an important artifact that I can use to talk to interested parties about when will we get to certain points in the backlog, because now I have a simulation for that. So really kind of a super valuable way to use AI for your delivery team. Now, on a smaller scale, you could potentially use this for something like sprint planning, where if you have a sprint goal, hopefully you know what those candidate backlog items are. Well, let's face it, sometimes our product backlog items or our product backlogs get into be kind of a mess. There sometimes are far more backlog items than one would want in a well-refined product backlog. Maybe you ask about your sprint goal and ask your AI to look through the product backlog and give you some other work items that might be appropriate in support of that sprint goal. It could look at the titles, it could look at the acceptance criteria. So some interesting ways there to support not just the long range release forecasting, but also look at, gosh, what might we do over the next 2 to 3 weeks from a sprint goal standpoint, and what product backlog items maybe pair well with that.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
Let's talk about bottlenecks. We'd love to have work flowing effectively through a system. What if our AI were able to look at our delivery data and start identifying some bottleneck trends? Where is the work getting stuck, either in our workflow, with specific people, with specific types of work item that we're delivering? It's super helpful to have an AI that can look at a tremendous volume of data and start to spot trends that we might otherwise be missing as humans or biased towards. So that might be kind of a fun way if you're using a flow-based system, or if you're Scrum-based and also tracking some good flow metrics. Maybe you can ask about what bottlenecks are potentially within your system. For your product owners and your quality specialists, because I see that there's a lot of connection between the people who are identifying acceptance criteria and those that need to confirm, hey, did we actually meet that? There's definitely some overlap of skills. What if you were to expand on product backlog item acceptance criteria using AI? Maybe what are we missing? Then as the quality specialists start to look at product backlog items, We can generate test cases, again, using a public tool or something within your technology ecosystem like Microsoft Copilot. What other acceptance criteria might there be? What test cases then should we consider? What about some negative tests in addition to those positive ones? You can generate not only test cases, but then use that as a way to automatically start to validate some of your assumptions about the product. Now, this one specifically, this next one coming up, is about within your ecosystem because you should not be putting your internal communications out. But a tool like Copilot has access to your Microsoft Teams, your Microsoft Outlook, etc. If you're using Copilot from Microsoft 365, now you can start looking at the sentiment with which you're engaging with your teammates. Look at your team communications, chats, emails, and you can start to ask about team morale, where there are some potential issues. Imagine, if you will, that you have some tension with a team member or you see some tension between your team members. What might you do about that? You could use that sentiment information to ask your AI, what are some strategies I might use for this particular situation, given some characteristics of the people involved, their preference for work style, the concerns that they have as part of how they do their work. Now you can have, I don't want to call it a therapist because I think that maybe gets into some ethical domains, but you have a thinking partner again for how might I approach this complicated situation between other humans. So, from a sentiment analysis and from coming up with some strategies to deal with sentiment or some tactics to increase or improve the sentiment, I think there's definitely some options that the artificial intelligence could provide there. Let's talk about risk management for a second. I know we're kind of all over the place here, but that's what I really love about AI is that it applies to so many different facets of your work. Once you maybe get over that hurdle of, gosh, should I really be doing this? Is it appropriate? Or how else might I do it? Maybe just haven't thought of some of these tactics or strategies. So let's talk risk management. Every project has risk, no matter how simple or how complicated. That's why I love the Scrum framework as a delivery tool within complex ecosystems, is because we can accelerate that risk and bring it forward and try to address it. You can now use your project information or historical data, descriptors of external factors or communications your team is having, and use your AI as a risk management partner. What are our risks? What are some strategies to either resolve that risk, make it go away? What are some tactics if I now own a risk? Now I have to make it go away. It's my responsibility. So I own it. What do I do with it? Maybe you get some ideas for which risks you should just accept because the costs of trying to mitigate that risk become tremendous. And then, of course, lastly, mitigating a risk. If the risk happens, what will we do instead? So use the ROAM, resolved, owned, accepted, mitigated approach to risk management and use your AI partner as a way of thinking about your strategy. And heck, you could use it to maintain your risk management artifacts as well if you're, again, using AI and comfortable with the fact that it is generating content in your data. Let's talk about prioritization. I've seen lots of 2x2 matrices where it's the value and the cost of addressing something or the investment to create it and the payback. I also will admit that it's kind of hard sometimes to maintain those artifacts. It turns into chore. What if we were now to use big data as a way of looking at the information we have about cost and benefit and then helping us with some suggestions for prioritization? Again, not turning the keys to the car over or taking your hands off the steering wheel, to use those metaphors, but it's really, now what do we do from a prioritization standpoint? What are some suggestions? So that's a consideration there. I've kind of shared several different ways to use artificial intelligence. Of course, we can have it create documents, PowerPoints, fun pictures. Hopefully, some of these specifics are helpful to you. I would love to hear back. What are you doing with artificial intelligence? What other ideas do you have? If you're not, what are those concerns that you have about artificial intelligence? Again, email me at podcast@agilethought.com, and I read those and would love to hear back. Until next time, thank you.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by Agile Thought. The views, opinions, and information expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and the guests, and do not necessarily represent those of Agile Thought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.